Well, hey everybody, and welcome to Theology Thursday. Good to be with you guys. Good to be with you, Doug. How you doing, buddy?
Holding up.
How was your Easter?
It was wonderful.
We're
Best
laughing.
Easter I've had in a while.
Yeah, we're laughing because we're actually recording this a week early. We're recording this on Thursday. So Doug and I were just kind of diving in, taking a look at some of the other themes that were coming. And Doug, you pulled up some cool stuff that we're actually going to see or have seen, I guess, this past week.
It's like
coming at us.
This is a message to the future.
Say that one more time.
This is a message to the future.
Yes, to echo in the age to come.
Yes.
All right, Doug. So you've got us jumping in into some of the themes that we're taking a look at in Matthew 27, right? And what I'm looking at here is that there's a number of allusions to two different psalms. You were saying, specifically Psalms 69 and 22, and there's some pretty cool imagery and some cool text that's coming out of there. You wanna explain a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So Matthew is obviously very steeped in Old Testament, and that's a well-known, he's often called the very Jewish gospel, although all the gospels have, serious roots in the Old Testament. And the way that he crafts this, his story of the crucifixion is interesting in that it really seems to be purposely reflective of, very much Psalm 22, but also Psalm 69. And the reason, a couple of reasons why this is significant. One of the things we mentioned last week in the talk about the resurrection, the historical reliability of the resurrection, is the lack of embellishment and kind of flair around the climax of the Gospels, that they're very much plain vanilla, kind of just almost get into this very serious historical reporting kind of mode. And as is noted sometimes, there's a lot of theological restraint that's used. Like, they don't attempt to say, to explain, at least like put it right out there and say, let's take a break for a minute. Let me tell you what this means. And yet this is clearly at the center of all of their narratives. It's a very interesting thing, and particularly this is so in Matthew, because if you read Matthew has these 11 what are called formula quotations, where he specifically says this happened to fulfill XYZ, or the words of the prophet were fulfilled, or something along where he uses the word fulfill, and then just butts in with scripture. Especially you see that around the birth and the early years of Jesus. Here, right. Psalm 22 is all over the place, and you don't have that there. He just seems to be constructing the narrative to kind of echo that, and it's just an interesting way that he's put it together. So I thought we would look at some of that, and then a few of the other interesting aspects of this account.
Sweet. All right. Which one of these do you want to dive into first here, Doug?
Well, let's talk about Psalm 69 first. Okay. Now, Psalm 69 technically only really has two or one, depending on how you count it, points of contact with Matthew's narrative. So just a little bit about Psalm 69. So Psalm 69 is a Psalm of David, which is usually taken to mean that David wrote it. And it's describing, it's one of his Psalms of lament, right? Where he's in trouble and he's calling out to the Lord. And it talks about how people mock him, and like the drunkards in the gate of the city are laughing at me and things like that. And all these things that his enemies are doing to him. Psalm 22 is actually a lot like that as well. And one of the things that's said in Psalm 69 is in verse 21 of the Psalm. It says, "Reproaches have broken my heart so that I am in despair. And I looked for pity, but there was none. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine."
Mm. And so this is the allusion to the wine mixed with gall, right?
Actually, yes. Well, and the other. So there's two times when they try to get Jesus to drink stuff here, right? The first is seemingly before he is hung on the cross. So he gets there, and he tells them that they have this wine mixed with gall there.
What is gall, Doug?
Okay, so it's probably not literally animal bile, like
Sure.
bile from the stomach, right? It's probably some kind of bitter herb. Some suggest worm. It may have been wormwood, but the apparent use here, from what it appears here, is that a lot of people think it's got some kind of narcotic use, and perhaps Jesus's refusal to drink it is the fact that he's committed to drinking the cup that the Father has for him. Like he's not looking to escape this moment, but he wants to do it. So that's reading a little bit into it, but that seems to be what's going on there. But the interesting thing here is that when Psalm 69:21, well, one of the interesting things says, "They gave me poison for food." It's the same word. It's the Greek word chale, which is the word that's translated gall. They gave me gall for food, or as I said, it's probably some kind of bitter plant of some sort. So it would be, they gave me this chale for food. And here they're offering him chale to drink. And then when he's on the cross, nearing the end, one of the bystanders there gets a sponge and fills it with this sour wine. It's probably a cheap wine that the soldiers are drinking or something, puts it on the sponge, sticks the sponge on a reed or a stick, and lifts it up to Jesus, which is, by the way, one of the ways we know that he was crucified far from the ground, right? It couldn't be held up. You needed a stick to lift it up to him. And that wine is called, and that sour wine, and again, another very specific Greek word, achas. And that's the same word you get in Psalm 69:21. So first he is offered chale, and then he is offered achas. And these are, so it seems to be that, and then again, you look at a lot of the other things surrounding in Psalm 69. Now, one brief thing.
Doug, let me cut in here real quick, because I've always wondered about this. So here's a soldier. He's reaching the spear up with this sour wine on it. Is this more of the mockery? Is this some type of like an attempted relief from the soldier for Jesus? Like what is this actual action that this soldier's doing?
I think that, well, okay, so first off, Matthew is not entirely clear that it was the soldier who lifted it up.
Okay.
Because it's the bystanders who misunderstand it, and then he says one of them came up and took a sponge and filled the bystanders who misunderstand Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani.
Sure.
So it's unclear. It seems like there's some kind of it's kind of like an act of mercy.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. I was never sure if it was an act of mercy or if it was like a continuation of some kind of humiliation of Jesus.
It's puzzling because certainly the gall at the beginning of it seems to be offered by the soldiers, and which is a little bit puzzling because it's like, are they trying to hurt him or are they trying to help him? But in my mind's eye, I don't really see those as mutually exclusive. Like they're cruel, but maybe they do wet his whistle a little bit. I don't know. I don't think it's as jarring as some people sometimes say.
Okay.
But okay, so now two things. So about Psalm 69. So first off, obviously Psalm 69 is written in Hebrew. So Matthew is written in Greek. So the Greek word, obviously what we're talking about here when we talk about them having the same words, we are talking about the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, which was used in Jesus's day by Greek-speaking Jews and by the early church. So that's when we say that's the same word, we're not talking about Hebrew, we're talking about Greek. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind now, the one reference is interesting, but it's compounded by the fact that when we observe that Psalm 69 is actually one of the most frequently quoted passages in the New Testament, when it's talking specifically in fulfillment of Christ type stuff, like Christ fulfilling it. And again, I've mentioned a couple times that one of the big apologetic tasks of the apostles who were preaching the cross of Christ is that we're saying that the Messiah suffered and died, right? And that did not seem like a thing the Messiah would do. And so it seems to have been the case that the early church treasured a lot of these passages that were Psalms where David is suffering. And he looks to the Lord for his deliverance and his vindication, and he is often given it in the Psalms. But nevertheless, so in essence, they're saying far from the idea that the Messiah would never suffer. No, we're showing that suffering at the hands of your enemies, especially for the name of the Lord, is very much what a Davidic king should do. In fact, here is the ultimate Davidic king suffering ultimately, right? So here's a couple of the other places the psalm is used in the New Testament.
I was going to say, yeah. So you said there's a number of places that that Matthew's actually quoting these psalms. Do you have some examples for us, Doug?
Yes. So this is the only place, as far as I know, that Matthew quotes Psalm 69, but or not quotes it, but uses it, because it's not a direct quote here. But throughout the New Testament, so John uses it twice. So when Jesus cleanses the temple in chapter 2, he drives the animals out and stuff. He says John tells us that when he was doing this, the disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And that's one of the things that David writes in that psalm in verse 9. And then in chapter 15, in the upper room, he's talking about how some people had seen Jesus is talking about how some people saw his works and still hated him. And he says, but the word that is written in their law must be fulfilled. It's interesting. He's calling a psalm the law, right? They hated me without cause. And that is Psalm 69:4. And then in Acts 1:20, this one's interesting, right? Because as I said, Psalm 69, there's not only is David reflecting on how he's feeling, but he's also referring to like what jerks his enemies are, right? Okay. How everyone is against him. And one of the things he says against them is, may his camp become desolate and let there be no one to dwell in it, in verse 25. And that is quoted in Acts 1:20, right after Judas kills himself. And they purchase the field of blood, Adel Kama, with the money, right? So again, like the thing that David is wishing for his enemies happens to Judas.
Wow.
And then
wow.
And then it's interesting. And then in Romans 11:9-10, Paul is talking about the widespread Jewish unbelief in his day and of the hardening of the people who reflected Jesus. He says this, and David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. Now, there are some differences there between the Greek that he's quoting from and the Hebrew version, but the point, for our sake, the point remains. He's citing the way that David was opposed by his countrymen in his day is the way that Jesus is opposed now. Wow. And then finally, he also uses it in Romans 15 as an illustration how we should bear with one another and even suffer for the sake of the church with one another. You know, other Christians who disagree with us and give us some trouble. And he says, for it is written, for Christ did not come to please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you, as in you, God, fell on me. And so that should be our attitude, just like it's Christ's. So it's interesting, right? Like, we all know of like the passages that like we always are going back to and things like that, right? Like, we're always citing Romans, we're always citing John, particularly John 3, or, you know, and here we can see some of the passages in the early church that they thought like that with, like, hey, this is particularly illustrative of Jesus.
That's interesting. So they've got their kind of coffee mug verses, and there are New Testament writers are throwing them all in there.
Yeah, these are on their coffee mugs for sure. Yeah.
So let me just catch up, Doug. So we're saying there's a lot of allusions in both Psalm 69 and Psalm 22. So far we've covered a number of them from 69. So in Psalm 69, verse 9 to John 2, verse 4 back to John 15, Psalm 69, 25 to Acts, and then Psalm 69, 22-23 to Romans, and then Romans 15:3 as well.
Yes.
Right?
I forgot this to include the Psalm verse in that one, but yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are the references there. Yeah.
All right, cool. So do we want to jump into Psalm 22?
Yeah, let's talk about Psalm 22, because this one I think has a lot more explicit connections.
Okay.
So first off, this again is another Davidic psalm, and I think we've talked a little bit about this already. This psalm already in our talks here, but let's So first off, the soldiers divide up his garments, and again, it's interesting that the language is so similar, and yet Matthew resists the temptation to put it in. Well, they didn't use quotes back then, right?
Right.
But to say, don't you remember this is written in the Psalms? It's almost like he's telling it in language that is just known to them because it's part of their mental cultural furniture. You know what I mean? Like if I was just like, describing our attitude towards church, and I was like, ask not what your church can do for you, but what you can do for your country. All of us would be like, Kennedy, of course. Like that's what he's alluding to. And all these associations would pop up. Same kind of thing here, right? So check out Psalm 22:16 through 18. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them. For my clothing, they cast lots.
I know this verse really, really very well. When I was in college and I first came to Christ, I was still just kind of figuring things out and reading through the Bible for the first time. And I was reading through Psalms, and I hit these two verses, and it just blew my mind. Like absolutely blew my mind. Hundreds of years before, and here's just a direct allusion to Jesus.
Yeah,
it's one of the coolest passages in Scripture.
I will say in passing, okay, so
go ahead, say it, because you nearly wrecked all of my worldview when you told me this the first time. Go ahead.
So given that I realize now that your faith does not rest on Psalm 21:16 or 22:16.
No, it does not.
The translation there, they have pierced my hands and feet, is it's almost certain that Psalm 22:16 does not say that.
Now, you said that the way that this has been translated, there were some kind of creative liberties a little bit to put it into the English language.
Well, the problem is that they don't, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in the Hebrew. Like it's very weird. So in Hebrew, I'm going to just translate it right from, I have the Hebrew right here. Okay.
Go ahead.
So evildoers surround me like a lion, my hands and feet. Okay. So dogs encircle me. A company of evildoers surround me like a lion, my hands and feet.
Interesting.
So it's very strange. Now, on the one thing, you could kind of get, like, there's obviously an ellipsis there, right? Like there's an omission of a verb in that last clause, like a lion, my hand and feet. And you might be able to and there are weirder things in ancient languages and in the scriptures, but for this reason, there's some people have suggested, and in fact, a bunch of the ancient versions, including the Septuagint, the Greek translation of it, take the word like a lion to be an extremely rare Hebrew verb instead of like a lion, actually a verb that means to dig. Okay. And so the idea would be, so the reason why the idea there, if you wanted to go make a case for pierced, you would say pierced my hands and feet, like dug out a part of my hands and feet would be the idea. But
does the following verse follow, Doug? I can count all my bones.
All right. So here's the thing. This verse, the reason why that's not disturbing to me is the same reason why I can say I don't know about the next verse, right?
Okay.
And that is that that none of the New Testament authors make a connection with this verse, right? No New Testament text cites this. Now, as I said, plenty of Psalm 22 is being alluded to left and right, especially that's exactly what we're talking about here, right?
Right.
But I don't think there's a huge challenge with I could say, I think it means like a lion, my hands and feet, and nothing follows from that, because none of the New Testament writers are like hinge on that and say fulfillment of scripture or something like that. You know what I mean? This is us as Christians reading it, and somewhere along the line in the history of interpretation, someone thought it would be a good idea to translate it pierced especially it's Psalm 22, you know, and
Right.
I'm guessing it's because, all right, if I'm going to take that as the verb that means to dig out, what does it mean to dig out hands and feet? Well, it's Psalm 22 and there's Jesus stuff all over it. So,
Right.
you know, it's not a far cry, but
Now,
I
to
would
that end, too, the
I would
following
agree
verse,
this
Doug,
is
right?
context.
The fact of them dividing up Jesus's garments is still there, right?
Yes. Okay. Yes. Let's get to that, right? Because So I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. So that's a conceptual thing that's going on at the cross. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Right. Again, not explicitly cited by Matthew, but clearly he intends an allusion here.
Mm.
Even though, you know, it historically happened, I think there's, you know, Matthew's got a ton of stuff he can select to mention here, and I think he's crafting it in a certain way that it has reverberations from the Old Testament. And then also the mocking in verse 43, right? They say this. What do the bystanders say? Among other things, they say, he trusts, or these are those walking by and wagging their heads. He trusts in God. Let him deliver him if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God. So, and here, they may be purposely quoting Psalm 22:7, which says, all who seek me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him.
Wow.
Right? Very, very. So it's either
almost verbatim.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Like the verbal connections are there. So Matthew, I think, is either, crafting their words so that they correspond, or perhaps he's pointing out an irony. You know, and then
So I see what you're saying now, Doug. You know what I mean? Because you look at the translation of Psalm 22, you know, specifically verses 16 to 18 that we were talking about just a moment ago, where maybe the translation has been a little, someone's looking into the translation a little bit, but like given the context of everything else in Psalm 22, you know what I mean? To dig into the hands or to pierce the hands, like I see what you're saying. Like I get it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, especially it's not it's not crazy. And there's actually some serious scholarly papers that do suggest that as a meaning. It's just that, like, I'm not sure the it's particularly strong, but it's kind of like the work of people who are like, oh, what does this fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls say about it? You know what I mean? Like, we're not going to get into that there, because then we'd be getting into how similar Yod and Vav look in that fragment, and so
the one that comes up next, which is kind of the coolest one, is the one from Jesus's mouth itself, right? Psalm 22:1, and what Jesus says on the cross.
Yeah. And I think we've covered that here, so I'm not going to elaborate too much on it, but
Sure.
my God, why have you forsaken me? The thing that I would just add, so here Jesus is actually quoting, he's kind of combining Hebrew and Aramaic, right? So the word for my God is Hebrew, Eli, right? Whereas in Aramaic it would be Elahi. But then Lama Sabachthani is Aramaic, whereas in Hebrew it's Lama Azavtani. Different words for forsake. And it's so that means forsaken me. The ni at the end is me. But what's interesting here is that Matthew notes that the bystanders misunderstand him, right? They think he's calling for Elijah, and you can imagine why, right? He's saying Eli, Eli, and they're like, oh, he must be. And I think, and this is a hunch, okay, this is kind of me just musing on what Matthew might mean by it. It appears to me that it's quite possible that he's saying, look how out of touch they are with what's actually going on, right? The Messiah's hanging on the cross. It's like Psalm 22 is all but like opened in the midst of them, and he's citing the first verse from it, and he's calling God's name, and they misunderstand him. You know what I mean? So like, look how out of tune they are. They don't even hear their own Messiah crying for his God. I think
it's fun. It's crazy that That makes me think of what Jesus said earlier in some of the parables, hearing they do not hear and seeing they do not see.
Yes.
It almost reminds me of that here's Jesus on the cross, direct allusions from Psalm 22:1, and Matthew's just kind of putting all that in front of us and saying they've got no idea. They have no idea what they're even witnessing.
Which of course is interesting because who does is the Roman soldiers.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
that's
look at this
crazy.
and they say, truly, this is probably a son of God. There's no definite article in Greek. It's a little questionable. But yeah. And that of course is typical Greco-Roman language, right? Like Caesar called himself son of God.
Right.
And mighty people were the gods were known. So it could be just like, this is a divine being of some sort, but they pick up on it. They see how he dies and the events that surround it. And they confess him to be the Son of God, something that nobody but since Peter has done. And this alludes to this theme in Matthew, right? Like, remember with the centurion in chapter 8, where he's like, I've never seen such great faith even in Israel. And I tell you, many will come from the east and the west to recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the first people who worship Jesus in the gospel are the Magoi from the east. Who bring gifts to him. And then Matthew ends telling us to go into all nations. So Matthew's got this concern, and here you see the Gentiles get it. Now, just before we leave Psalm 22, I want to also know another thing that's interesting is that in the last thing that Jesus does on the before he dies in Matthew is it says that he cried out and yelled with a loud voice, and then he yielded up his spirit. And that verb to cry out is a very common verb in Greek, but in Psalm 22, it occurs several different times in verse 2 and verse 5 and verse 24, right? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer. And then in verse 5, to you, our fathers cried and were rescued, and you saved them. And then in verse 24, he has not despised or abhorred his servant. He has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. So this crying of Jesus on the cross may also be another deliberate echo here of Psalm 22.
That's so cool, man. There's Psalm 22 all over this place. And then, with that as well, there's, you note on these notes here in front of me too, Doug, that there's quite a lot of imagery that's apocalyptic as well.
So there, just the other, and we're kind of barreling through all this. There's obviously lots of interesting stuff to say, but so now another very Old Testament-y kind of thing that Matthew does is he describes Jesus's death by being accompanied by a variety of extraordinary events. And these events I take to be historical. I take all of these. I don't think there's reason based on what Matthew says to say, oh, no, he's just kind of like using apocalyptic imagery. But no, because I don't think I just don't see a reason to say. I do think he means apocalyptic illusions. And by the way, apocalyptic is basically a specific genre, specific flavor of Jewish literature at the time, where you have kind of like the cosmic struggle between good and evil, and God and his powers, and the evil one and his powers in this struggle. And it's often told in very symbolic ways. Oftentimes there will be an angelic guide. So apocalyptic imagery, think the book of Revelation is like the huge Christian example of it. But at any rate, darkness is apocalyptic imagery for, this cataclysmic day of the Lord stuff happening. You have the earthquake. Earthquakes are often apocalyptic, judgment of God type imagery. Think Jeremiah 10:10, Joel 3:16, Nahum 1:5-6. And even the concept of the resurrection of the dead. And we talked about some of the different nuances that is given in passages like Daniel 12, Isaiah 26, and Ezekiel 37. But but that too is that too occurs in those are apocalyptic type texts. And then the tearing of the curtain, that doesn't really have an analog in apocalyptic literature, but it's part and parcel with that. Now, the last thing I'll just say is this: on this tearing of the temple, there's some question as to which curtain it was. Was it the outer curtain or was it the inner curtain? The outer curtain would separate the entire temple from the outside world, whereas the inner temple is the one that cordons off
Holy
the
of holies, right?
Right. And it's not entirely clear which one Matthew has. Now, the common understanding of this, and I think this is a correct inference, is that this indicates that the way to God is no longer blocked. Like, what is on the curtain of the temple? It's cherubim engraven, embroidered in gold, right? To symbolize the entrance to the Garden of Eden, right? You're not allowed back in here, and the Lord placed a cherubim at the entrance of the Garden of Eden. Hey, Carrie, you're on camera. And so that the Holy of Holies symbolizes that you're entering back into this sacred space that's forbidden to man and guarded by God's cherubim. And now that's ripped, and you're all welcome, and you're welcome into the presence of God through Christ. But there may be some other things that have been suggested, okay? Two other fascinating things.
There you go, Doug. I was telling my community group about this. Like, there was a theologian that told me this one time. He said, once you understand the gospel, stop. Praise the Lord and wait for him to come back.
Well, this is gospel stuff too. So let me just...
Sure.
Two other things that I've come across in my reading, and do with them what you may. Now, I obviously am a big favor, and it may not even be an either or thing. Some of these imagery stuff is not. But also keep in mind, Jesus has foretold the end of the temple, the judgment upon the temple, and this may have to do with that. The other thing, which is suggested, and I'm still kind of like, I don't know what I think about this, right? But what did the high priest do when Jesus uttered his blasphemy?
He tore his robes.
He tore his robes. Right? Here is the temple of God itself. Jesus dies. And it is torn.
That's interesting. I never even thought about that before.
I'm not quite sure, but maybe.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So
Fair
at any
enough.
rate, I think that's enough for today. But that's what some observations on Matthew 27.
That's awesome. Doug, thank you so much. So for everybody that's been kind of following along, there's a lot of really cool allusions straight out of Matthew 27 back to particularly Psalm 22 and Psalm 69. So, as we're studying together, and it's post-Easter now, but if you'd like to go back and kind of study some of the references that specifically go back to these verses, Psalm 22 and Psalm 69 would be a great passages to study for this week. And to that end, we pray that God would bless you in your study, that you'd be encouraged and challenged toward Christ. And until we see you next time, take care. God bless. And we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.